Ilhan Omar had just looked across the hearing room at the President of the United States, called him a six-time bankrupt, and suggested America should send him back while nearly 10 million people watched. She delivered the insult with a smile, certain the room belonged to her, certain the crowd had chosen its hero, and certain the clip would dominate the night before Trump could recover. The gallery exploded exactly as her team expected, with supporters cheering, phones rising, producers whispering, and social media accounts racing to package the moment as a clean political victory. Within minutes, the exchange had gathered tens of thousands of shares, spreading as the kind of short, emotional confrontation modern politics rewards faster than any careful argument. Omar believed she had forced Trump into the role she wanted, the defensive billionaire trapped by his own record. But she had misread the one reaction capable of destroying that plan. The hearing room was already built for spectacle, packed beyond the emptiness of a routine committee session, and overheated by cameras, lights, cables, reporters, staffers, supporters, and operatives waiting for a viral moment. The air carried coffee, floor wax, and the strained anticipation of people who knew they were not attending an ordinary exchange of prepared remarks. Omar sat upright in a burgundy hijab and navy blazer, folders aligned, water untouched, posture disciplined with the practiced confidence of someone accustomed to entering hostile rooms and refusing to shrink. Her opening recalled the refugee camp in Kenya, the years of waiting, her arrival in America at 12, and the powerful men who had told her she did not belong. She returned to the 2019 rally and the chant demanding that she be sent back, then contrasted her arrival with nothing against Trump's inheritance and 6 bankruptcies. For several seconds, the strategy looked flawless because the crowd erupted with the sound of people who believed they were witnessing long-delayed revenge. Omar's supporters did not offer polite applause. They released years of anger in one burst, convinced their champion had finally delivered the line Trump could not escape. In the press gallery, producers recognized the clip immediately, and Omar's communications team understood that the opening had landed exactly as designed. The insult was already being framed as the defining moment of the hearing before Trump had said a single word in response. Then Trump laughed, and the entire calculation began to break apart in public. It was not the stiff laugh of a politician pretending not to be wounded, but a full, uncontrolled reaction that moved his shoulders, pulled back his head, and filled the chamber with genuine amusement. That difference mattered because a political attack requires visible damage, and when the target laughs sincerely, the insult begins to shrink along with the person who delivered it. Omar's supporters hesitated because they had expected anger, denial, or defensiveness, not the unmistakable sound of a man who believed he had just been handed an opening. Trump leaned toward the microphone, acknowledged the bankruptcy count, and said he was flattered that she had counted all the way to 6. Then he shifted from his numbers to hers, and the hearing stopped being a celebration of Omar's attack and became an examination of the figures she had not expected him to raise. Trump introduced the number that would control the room, $250 million, while keeping the same grin that had already disrupted Omar's opening. He contrasted his bankruptcies with buildings and assets, then said Omar had a number of her own and had turned that money into nothing. The delivery was theatrical, but the figure was specific, and specificity changed the atmosphere from partisan entertainment to uncomfortable attention. He raised a printed page and began discussing the Meals Act, a program with a name so politically protected that opposing it would sound like opposing food for children. The law passed with bipartisan support, Trump signed it, and the story he presented was that $250 million later, the public was left with fraud, missing money, and a moral label covering financial disaster. Some people laughed when Trump described the disappearance like a magic trick, but the laughter died as the details became harder to dismiss as performance. He said the program was supposed to feed children, including Somali children, in Omar's district, and then asked how many meals had actually been served. he let the pause hang before giving the roundest and most devastating answer available: zero. He followed with 79 indictments, 56 guilty pleas, and the claim that 89% of those prosecuted were Somali, tying the scandal directly to the community Omar claimed to defend. $250 million, zero meals, and dozens of criminal cases now sat in the room with more weight than the insult that had opened the night. The change in the gallery was quiet but unmistakable, because supporters did not suddenly applaud Trump or abandon Omar. They simply became more attentive and less certain. A woman in a blue hijab shifted in her seat, not in rejection, but with the involuntary movement of someone processing information that did not fit the story. She arrived believing. Omar's folded hands separated, and one moved toward a folder as though a document might offer a quick answer, but the folder remained closed. Trump turned the page and reduced the showmanship, replacing broad mockery with names, dates, and claims specific enough to force the room to listen. That was when the exchange became more dangerous for Omar, because Trump stopped sounding like an entertainer and started sounding like a man reading from a record. He named Safari Restaurant and recalled Omar appearing on Somali television to thank the business for serving thousands of meals each day to children. The problem, as Trump presented it, was that prosecutors identified Safari as the largest fraud site in the network and said it served zero meals rather than the thousands publicly claimed. He emphasized that Omar had praised the restaurant in Somali to her own community, while investigators later described it as a central point in the scheme. The money attributed to those meals, he said, moved toward luxury cars, real estate, and wire transfers connected to overseas accounts now being traced by the Treasury Department. Omar's jaw tightened as the room understood that the hearing had moved beyond a viral insult, beyond local fraud, and into the machinery of federal financial investigation. That single reference to the Treasury Department changed the scale of the hearing, because federal tracing across borders is not the language of a campaign argument. It is the language of an investigation already moving through accounts, entities, and jurisdictions. Trump did not need to raise his voice because the words themselves carried enough force, and the room understood that luxury cars and real estate were no longer the most serious destination being discussed. Omar's expression tightened only slightly, but under 14 cameras, even a small physical reaction became visible evidence that the subject had reached a place she had not expected. She leaned toward the microphone and returned to the defense that had protected her through years of attacks, arguing that the accusations belonged to a broader campaign targeting Muslims and Somali communities. It was the familiar shield, politically effective because it shifted attention from the transactions under examination to the motives of the people examining them. Trump rejected that shift immediately and said federal enforcement was not in Minneapolis because of him, but because $250 million had been stolen and part of the money had allegedly traveled overseas. He connected the enforcement presence directly to the Meals Act and asked the question Omar's team could not reduce to racism: whether the real attack on the Somali community came from the man demanding the money back or the lawmaker whose legislation allowed it to disappear. The sentence hit harder than an insult because it forced the people in Omar's own section to choose between loyalty to a political symbol and anger over money intended for their children. Silence moved through the gallery, not the silence of outrage, but the silence of people recognizing a question they had discussed privately and never expected Trump to voice publicly. In the second row, a man wearing a kufi removed his stand with Ilhan button and turned it over in his hand without putting it away. Trump then moved away from the government's money and toward Omar's personal financial disclosures, a shift that made the hearing narrower, more intimate, and more difficult to dismiss as general political theater. He held up 3 pages and described a progression that, on its face, looked less like ordinary business growth than a set of federal forms contradicting one another. In 2023, according to the disclosure he cited, her husband's business assets were valued at roughly $51,000, a small and unremarkable amount for a modest consulting operation. In 2024, the same category reportedly expanded to a range between $6 million and $30 million, transforming a minor company into a multi-million-dollar enterprise within one reporting period. Trump mocked the jump as alchemy because, even by the standards of aggressive entrepreneurship, the increase demanded an explanation stronger than optimism, branding, or political connections. The next filing made the contradiction worse because an amendment later reduced the reported figure from as much as $30 million to approximately $95,000. Omar's explanation characterized the discrepancy as an accounting error, but Trump emphasized the obvious problem that a difference approaching $29.9 million is not a misplaced decimal or a forgotten receipt. It is a fundamentally different answer to the same question, submitted on documents whose purpose is to provide the public with an accurate picture of a federal officeholder's financial interests. He reminded the room that these were not social media estimates or partisan rumors, but formal disclosures filed under legal obligation. Omar pressed one hand against the edge of the table, the subtle movement of someone attempting to maintain control, while the argument beneath her public defense became increasingly unstable. Trump next identified Rose Lake Capital, the company associated with Omar's husband, and focused on its claimed scale rather than simply mocking its existence. According to the company's own public material, it managed $60 billion in assets, a figure large enough to place it beside major financial institutions and sophisticated investment firms. Yet, Trump said the company was not registered with the Securities and Exchange Commission in the manner audiences would expect from an operation claiming control over that level of capital. He then pointed to its business address, a WeWork location, turning the contrast between $60 billion and a rented desk into the simplest image of the night. The gallery laughed again, not because the underlying question was harmless, but because the mismatch was so extreme that ridicule became the fastest way to express disbelief. Trump used his own experience in real estate to sharpen the comparison, saying he had constructed physical buildings from steel and concrete without making claims as extravagant as those attached to the small rented office. The boast was pure Trump, but the point did not depend on admiring his buildings, because the issue was whether Rose Lake Capital possessed the regulatory structure, personnel, and physical presence expected of a firm managing $60 billion. The hearing had now moved through missing meals, overseas transfers, contradictory disclosures, and a company valuation that appeared detached from the ordinary evidence of a financial enterprise. Each subject reinforced the next, creating a chain in which no single discrepancy needed to carry the full accusation by itself. Omar's original attack about bankruptcies had become almost irrelevant because the room was no longer judging Trump's past businesses, it was examining the paperwork connected to hers. Trump set down the financial disclosure pages and introduced another number, $2.78 million, the amount he said Omar's campaign had paid to a consulting firm between 2019 and 2020. The money came from campaign donors, including small contributors who sent $10, $25, or $50 because they saw Omar as a representative of their struggle and their community. The consulting firm, E Street Group, was owned by Tim Minott, the man Omar was dating at the time and later married. Trump framed the sequence without embellishment because the structure was damaging enough. Donor money flowed into the company owned by her romantic partner, and the partner later became her husband. His joke about paying for his own marriages drew laughter, but beneath it sat a serious question about whether campaign spending had financially benefited the person sharing Omar's private life. To make the issue personal, Trump named Amira, a prep cook in Cedar Riverside, earning approximately $26,000 a year and donating $50 each month. He described the contribution not as disposable political spending, but as a sacrifice made by someone who believed Omar represented people who had rarely possessed influence in Washington. $50 from that income was not a symbolic click on a fundraising page. It was money that could have gone toward food, rent, transportation, or a child's needs. Trump's argument was that this sacrifice entered Omar's campaign and then moved toward a company owned by the man she eventually married. The woman in the blue hijab stopped watching Omar and looked down at her own folded hands as though the distance between donor loyalty and personal enrichment had suddenly become visible. Omar finally responded that payments to political consultants were standard, an answer designed to normalize the transaction by placing it inside routine campaign practice. The defense was technically broad enough to be true in general because campaigns regularly pay consultants for strategy, advertising, fundraising, and communications. Trump cut through that abstraction with a flat statement that standard practice does not include marrying the consultant. He did not grin, perform, or stretch the line into a speech, because the bluntness gave it more force than theatrical outrage could have delivered. Omar closed her mouth and glanced toward her attorney, who continued writing without looking up, leaving the cameras to capture the distance between a client searching for relief and counsel refusing to provide it publicly. The room had now crossed decisively from partisan confrontation into something resembling a deposition, with every number narrowing the available space for a political answer. Omar could still challenge Trump's motives, history, tone, and treatment of her community, but those arguments did not reconcile zero meals with $250 million or $30 million with $95,000. They did not explain why a company claiming $60 billion operated from a WeWork address, and they did not remove the intimate relationship between the campaign, E Street Group, and Tim Minette. Trump understood that he no longer needed another joke because the record he had assembled was doing the work for him. He straightened in his chair, lowered his voice, and prepared to explain that everything discussed so far was merely the public portion of a much larger process already unfolding behind closed doors. Trump leaned toward the microphone and said he wanted to finish with something that was not a joke, stripping away the last trace of performance from his voice. He emphasized that every figure already discussed, from the $250 million to Safari Restaurant, Rose Lake Capital, and E Street Group, came from records the public could examine. Anyone could verify the filings, compare the numbers, and decide whether the explanations matched the documents submitted under federal requirements. But Trump said the public record was only the visible layer, while a much more serious process was already moving behind closed doors. The room tightened because everyone understood that the previous disclosures, damaging as they were, had only been preparation for what he was about to announce. He said the Department of Justice had expanded the Feeding Our Future investigation beyond the original 79 indictments and the cases already moving through the courts. According to his statement, new subpoenas had been issued, additional documents were being examined, and investigators were pursuing targets outside the original circle of defendants. The investigation was no longer limited to asking how the money left the federal program or who spent it in Minnesota. It was tracing what happened after the funds moved through those entities, including where the money traveled once it crossed state and national boundaries. Trump delivered the announcement with the authority of a president describing federal machinery that was already operating, not a candidate promising what he might investigate later. He said the Treasury Department was following wire transfers connected to Feeding Our Future entities and examining accounts located overseas. He refused to identify the country publicly, saying the investigation remained active and that he would not compromise it by revealing details prematurely. Then he added that Omar knew which country investigators were examining and that the American public would learn soon enough. The statement was carefully limited in detail but devastating in implication because it placed Omar inside the circle of people presumed to understand where investigators were looking. Whether the audience interpreted that as knowledge, proximity, or political responsibility, the effect was the same. Every camera in the room moved back toward her. Omar stopped moving for several seconds, and the stillness communicated more than any interruption or angry denial could have communicated in that moment. She did not reach for her folder, whisper to counsel, adjust her clothing, or perform the small motions people use to disguise stress under bright lights. Around her, reporters shifted, producers typed, staffers exchanged glances, and members of the gallery reacted physically to the disclosure. Omar remained fixed while the President of the United States publicly connected an expanded Justice Department investigation to overseas financial tracing. The contrast between the movement surrounding her and her complete stillness made the moment impossible for the cameras to ignore. The press gallery erupted through motion rather than noise as reporters abandoned their existing drafts and began sending urgent messages to editors, producers, and assignment desks. Trump had confirmed on camera that federal investigators were expanding a case associated with legislation championed by a sitting member of Congress. The story was no longer about an insult, a laugh, or even a scandal involving stolen meal funds. It now involved active subpoenas, cross-border transactions, federal financial monitoring, and the possibility that additional targets had not yet been publicly named. Every journalist in the room understood that the hearing had just produced a disclosure large enough to dominate more than one news cycle. Trump continued by saying the Internal Revenue Service was reviewing the tax and business status connected to Rose Lake Capital. He returned briefly to the contrast between the firm's claim of managing $60 billion and its connection to a rented WeWork address, but the joke now served as an entry point into regulatory scrutiny. A company making claims of that size would normally be expected to leave a substantial trail of registrations, disclosures, audited statements, personnel, and operational infrastructure. The question was no longer whether the claim sounded absurd, but whether the filings supporting that claim could withstand examination by agencies empowered to demand records. Trump's sarcasm remained controlled because the institutions he named carried more weight than any insult he could invent. He then announced that a federal grand jury in Washington had issued subpoenas seeking business records connected to Tim Minett and the entities E Street Group, ESTCRU, and Rose Lake Capital. According to Trump, those subpoenas had been issued the previous week, meaning the process was not a spontaneous response to the hearing or a threat invented for television. The documents were already being demanded, attorneys were already involved, and the businesses named in the room were already facing formal legal scrutiny. Trump joked that he probably was not supposed to know certain details, but knew them because he was president, giving the disclosure a casual tone that made it sound even more dangerous. He smiled afterward, not with the laughter that had answered Omar's opening insult, but with the satisfaction of someone who believed the argument had reached its unavoidable conclusion. In the gallery, the man wearing the kufi stopped turning the stand with Ilhan button in his hand and placed it on the empty seat beside him. He did not throw it away, hide it, or dramatically announce that he had changed sides, because the moment required no theatrical declaration. The button remained visible but unworn, a small symbol of political loyalty, temporarily separated from the person who had carried it into the room. That quiet decision reflected the larger change taking place among Omar's supporters, many of whom were not prepared to embrace Trump, but could no longer dismiss every question he raised. Doubt had entered the section that began the evening cheering, and doubt was far more threatening to Omar than anger from opponents who had never supported her. The chairman asked whether Omar wished to respond, and she stood because silence would have appeared even more damaging after the announcements that had just filled the room. She described the hearing as politically motivated targeting, accused the administration of weaponizing federal institutions, and returned again to the argument that Somali and Muslim communities were being treated as convenient political enemies. The language was familiar, disciplined, and delivered with controlled fury, exactly as years of congressional conflict had trained her to deliver it. Yet, the defense focused on why Trump and his administration might be pursuing her rather than answering the specific financial contradictions he had placed into the record. Motive could explain hostility, but it could not reconcile the money, the filings, the campaign payments, the overseas transfers, or the newly announced subpoenas. The room that had rewarded Omar's opening attack was no longer available to reward that defense because it had accumulated too many unanswered figures in too little time. It had heard $250 million paired with 0 meals, a $30 million valuation reduced to $95,000, and $60 billion claimed from a rented office. It had heard about $2.78 million in campaign payments to a company owned by the man Omar later married. It had also heard the president announce an expanded Justice Department investigation, Treasury tracing, an IRS review, and grand jury demands for business records. Trump sat back without interrupting because he understood that another attack would add nothing. The numbers had already taken control of the hearing, and Omar's answer had not taken control back. Trump said nothing while Omar completed her response because he no longer needed to compete for the room, and the stillness of the man who had dominated the previous minutes became more damaging than another interruption. He leaned back with the relaxed posture of someone who believed the evidence had already been delivered, the argument had already been decided, and every additional word from his opponent merely revealed how little room remained for a direct answer. He did not look at Omar, not because she had recovered, but because the performance had reached the point where staring at her would have appeared excessive and weakened the effect of what had already landed. Instead, he watched the gallery, the reporters, and the cameras, measuring the reaction of the audience that had begun the evening cheering against him and was now carrying a list of numbers it could not easily forget. Omar had opened by demanding that America send back the man who wasted money, but Trump had turned the accusation around and placed her own financial record under the lights. Outside the hearing room, Omar's communications director stared at a prepared statement that had become useless before he could release it. The draft had been written for the hearing his team expected, one in which Omar confronted Trump over his rhetoric, his record, and the rally crowd that once demanded she be sent away. That statement assumed the night would remain focused on Trump, allowing Omar's staff to package her as the fearless refugee confronting the powerful man who had targeted her community. Instead, the hearing had become a discussion of missing funds, contradictory disclosures, campaign payments, federal subpoenas, treasury tracing, and an expanded Justice Department investigation. The communications director opened a new document, typed the words "the representative," and stopped because every sentence that might follow sounded weaker than the announcements already circulating through the building. 2 clips emerged from the hearing and overwhelmed every other exchange, but they spread for entirely different reasons. The first showed Omar's bankruptcy insult, Trump's uncontrolled laugh, and his immediate pivot from her count of his failures to the financial numbers associated with her record. That clip traveled because the laugh destroyed the emotional structure of Omar's attack, replacing the expected image of an offended president with the image of a man delighted by the opportunity she had accidentally handed him. Her line became the setup to his response, and the more viewers replayed the moment, the smaller her original insult appeared beside the information that followed. Within days, the clip had gathered tens of millions of views because audiences were not merely watching a confrontation, they were watching control of the confrontation change hands in seconds. The second clip carried none of the humor of the first because it showed Trump announcing the expanded Justice Department investigation, Treasury wire tracing, an IRS review, and grand jury subpoenas. Legal commentators, compliance professionals, financial investigators, and attorneys circulated that portion separately because they understood the significance of a president describing active federal processes on camera. Once those statements entered the public record, Omar's team could challenge Trump's motives, but it could not pretend the announcements had never been made. Every institution Trump named possessed its own procedures, documentary demands, and authority, meaning the story could continue independently of the political spectacle that introduced it. What began as a hearing clip had transformed into a legal and financial narrative capable of generating new developments long after the cameras left the room. During the first week, Omar's office released a statement describing the hearing as political prosecution disguised as oversight. The statement attacked the administration's purpose, condemned the targeting of Somali Americans, and argued that Trump was using federal power to punish a political opponent. Yet, it did not explain the $250 million, the zero meals alleged at Safari Restaurant, the changing asset values, the Rose Lake Capital claims, or the campaign payments to E Street Group. It also avoided the substance of the DOJ expansion, the Treasury tracing, the IRS review, and the grand jury demands announced during the hearing. The omission was devastating because a response centered entirely on motive sounded like an admission that the underlying figures were too dangerous to address directly. The reaction in Minneapolis created an even larger problem because the strongest pressure did not come from Republicans, Trump supporters, or media personalities already hostile to Omar. Somali American business owners and community leaders in Cedar Riverside began requesting transparency about the distribution, oversight, and disappearance of funds intended to feed children. Their statement did not condemn Omar or declare her guilty of wrongdoing, but it asked her to cooperate fully and explain what she knew about the systems operating inside her district. That request carried more moral force than another partisan accusation because it came from people whose names, businesses, families, and reputations were being dragged through the scandal. A federal subpoena could demand records, but a public request from the community Omar claimed to represent demanded something harder to produce: credibility. 6 days after the hearing, the Justice Department confirmed that the Feeding Our Future investigation had expanded, offering little detail but using the exact word Trump had placed into the national conversation. The confirmation was restrained and procedural, but that restraint made it more serious because institutions do not speak with the exaggeration of political rallies. Additional financial instruments and cross-border transactions were being examined, confirming that investigators were looking beyond the original convictions and guilty pleas. Trump's announcement had been theatrical, but the department's confirmation sounded like machinery engaging behind a closed door. Omar could continue calling the process political, yet each institutional step made the argument that nothing real was happening increasingly impossible to sustain. The IRS also began reviewing the business filings connected to Rose Lake Capital, focusing attention on the enormous asset management claims and the limited physical presence associated with the company. A firm claiming control over $60 billion would ordinarily be expected to produce a vast regulatory and operational footprint, including registrations, personnel, clients, records, and structures proportionate to that scale. The contrast between those expectations and a WeWork address had already created the sharpest joke of the hearing, but under federal review, the joke became a compliance question. What had sounded ridiculous in the chamber now had to be explained in documents, and documents are less forgiving than political speeches. The difference between a discrepancy being visible and an agency formally examining it was simply the difference between public suspicion and institutional attention. By the third week, an attorney representing Tim Minott confirmed receipt of subpoenas related to E Street Group, ESTCRU, and Rose Lake Capital. The response said Minott would cooperate with lawful requests, avoiding the aggressive language of a witch hunt or politically motivated attack. That choice of words mattered because cooperation is the vocabulary of someone preparing to navigate a real investigation rather than dismiss it as an imaginary one. Grand jury proceedings remained secret, but the existence of the document demands meant the companies named by Trump were now being required to answer outside the hearing room. Omar's supporters could argue over the fairness of the process, yet fairness and existence were no longer the same question, and the existence of the process had become undeniable. Omar's campaign raised millions in the weeks after the confrontation because political controversy has always been capable of producing money, but the geography of the donations began to shift. More support arrived from distant progressive strongholds, while fewer contributions came from the Minnesota communities most directly affected by the unanswered questions. People far away saw Omar primarily as a symbol under attack, while people inside the district were closer to the businesses, families, and children attached to the scandal. Among them was Amira, the low-wage donor whose name Trump had used to represent the sacrifice behind every $50 contribution, and although she did not immediately cancel her donation, she began to question it for the first time. Omar had entered the hearing intending to send Trump back with the weight of 6 bankruptcies, but Trump ended the night by sending the public a receipt filled with numbers, filings, investigations, and questions that her original insult could not erase.